All right, so I had a friend ask me the other day that's just starting out with watercolors, what kind of watercolors are the best and what's the difference between liquid watercolors, tube watercolors, and cake or pan watercolors. So in this video, I will be using Ecoline liquid watercolors. I will be using Prima Marketing cake watercolors. So these are called cake or pan watercolors. They're um, hard and I can touch them, and I just spray them with a water to activate them with a water bottle. And then for my tube watercolors, I am using Grumbacher, and one of them is Van Gogh. So I think that these are all pretty good quality product. It would be hard to compare if I had like a cake watercolor set that was like a Crayola or a really inexpensive cheap brand. You are going to get different results if you use a less quality product. So I feel like these are all pretty comparable in so that in their quality, in their pigment. So they're going to be it will be a fair comparison, I think. Some other supplies that I'm going to have is I'm using some watercolor paper, which is really important when you do watercolor. Watercolor paper is you need to buy some better quality watercolor paper. At least like the lowest quality would probably be Kansan watercolor. You're not going to be able to do the same watercolor effects on paper like even cardstock. It won't be the same, and so you need a good quality watercolor paper. They are treated with sizing, and so it keeps the watercolor on top of the paper instead of sinking through and to the bottom and going through the paper. So that is something that is worth having, is good watercolor paper. All right, I am using this little container that I got at Walmart for $1, and I'm going to put my tube watercolors in this. I like these containers. As you can see, I've already used this, but this is old paint. It's all dried up, so it shouldn't hopefully be a problem for me. I like using these because they come with a lid, and it makes it portable for me, and portability is really important for me. That's one of the benefits of the cake watercolors, is they are already portable just by their nature. Unless you spray them like crazy like I just did, and then you try and close them up and throw them in your bag, that's gonna make a little bit of a mess. But when they're all dry, they are naturally portable. These ones you can make portable, of course, like I'm going to do right now, and I've actually done that in the past. I've bought containers and these empty little plastic things, and so I made these with this kind of watercolor because it is a high quality watercolor, so you can make them portable. It's just it takes a little bit more work, and you pay for it. So of course you are going to pay for the container and the things along with the watercolor. So all right, so another thing too that this is more of just a convenience thing. So tube watercolor is so pigmented and rich and beautiful, and you're going to get stronger colors when you first pour them. And so I don't do a whole lot because I do like that quality of them already being very pigmented and rich and juicy, where you're going to have to work a lot harder to reactivate these. And same with once they're dry. Even though, like, this is one of my watercolor palettes from all of the tube paint that I have. Not all of the tube paint that I have, but some of the tube paint that I have. So I do use it even after it dries, but I like to keep it soft and pliable. So this is a better option. But one thing I don't like about these tube watercolors is trying to get them open sometimes can be a hassle. You might need to get a tool, just a clamp, something to clamp onto so that you can twist it open. And I didn't go and get a tool, and so I totally tore a hole in this one. And so now I'm squeezing out the side, which is going to make it dry out sooner. So that's just one of those things where I'm like, that has happened to me before, and getting these lids off is a little hard. So sometimes these are just not the most easy to start with. Whereas I will be honest with you, I use cake watercolors the most just because they are so easy to just start, where I don't have to like pour stuff and mess around with lids and finding containers and all of that. So, all right, so I still gave each of these a squirt because they are extremely pigmented. So you're still going to dilute or activate them with water also. And then here, these ones, they come already liquid. So you don't have to give them a squirt of water. And I actually also make them portable. I buy these little containers and I mix my own colors. So I do a couple drops of, green and yellow, and I made this lime green color. And I put them in these little dropper containers. But you can also put them on a color palette. Let me show you. I have another set here of watercolors. These are koi watercolors. And I'm just going to open it up and use the palette that comes with it. So I'm going to put a couple drops of green and yellow just to kind of show you. These are kind of a pain in the butt to open too. They get stuck. The nice thing about these, they are pre-mixed for you. Really rich color, smooth. They lay down smooth. Because they're pre-mixed and smooth, they are going to be extremely translucent. So you're going to get a very clear layer when you use them. Okay, I also have 2 things of water. One of them, they're both clean water, but I use these all the time so they look a little dirty. But I have one for washing my brushes and one that I'm going to keep clean so that I can use it to lay down clean water before I add watercolor to that area. And then I have a couple different paintbrushes. I have this squirrel hair paintbrush that I use to lay down washes. It holds a lot of water in the belly of the brush, so it's great for spreading and washing. Doing washes, I have a fine 20 liner. This is AIT products. I just ordered it on Amazon. I have a flat brush, a dagger brush. This is from Hobby Lobby. It's a 1/4 inch dagger. A pencil, filbert, which is kind of a blend of a flat brush, but they've rounded out the top. That's a size 10. I have a size 8 round brush. And those are the watercolor brushes I'm going to be using today. So let's start out with just a simple, this is where I always start with watercolors. We're just gonna test this out. So the first thing that we are going to do is, there are 4 basic ways to apply watercolor. So we have wet on wet. So we're talking about the watercolor being wet and the paper being wet. We have wet on dry, so we're talking about the watercolor being wet and the paper being dry. We have dry on dry. So this is a little bit misleading because dry watercolor would not come off, but basically it's the paintbrush that's dry added to dry paper. And then we have dry watercolor wet paper. All right, so we are going to do a little test swatch for each one of these. And then we are going to paint a butterfly. This is going to be our project, and we're going to do 3 butterflies to test these all out. So let's start with our liquid watercolor. I am going to use some clean water, and I'm just going to wet that area with my brush. And I'm going to take my round brush, I'm going to wet my round brush, I'm going to dab it on my paper towel. Have a towel or a paper towel always handy. A lot of times I just have a rag. And I'm just going to pick up some of this paint with the tip of the brush, and I'm going to just drop it in there. Okay. Now I can also use these droppers. So this is one of those things that I love about liquid watercolor. So you can see that it is pooling a little bit in this corner, which is not something that we want. So I'm just going to take that water out with the corner of my paper towel. And I am going to drop some more watercolor in there. It would help with the pooling and the wrinkling of the paper if I used tape to tape it down, or if I pre-stretched my paper, but I rarely do that. So, and I can manipulate that color as I tilt the paper. Another fun thing to do is to make it actually drip, which is really easy to get a really good pour with liquid watercolors. Okay, the next one we're going to do is we're going to do wet watercolor with a dry paper. So I'm just going to wet my brush. I'm going to just dab it on my paper towel just to get rid of the heavy droplets. And I'm going to make a circle there. So the difference with the dry paper is it's going to make a hard edge, whereas this one has more of a soft edge. Okay, we have dry on wet. So to me, this is a lot harder to accomplish with these watercolors because they are already wet. So I'm going to take a dry brush and I'm going to just get the tip wet and go through. So I still get a finer line, but, and hopefully you can see that, it's going to have a softer edge because I pre-wet my paper. And then dry on dry, I'm going to use my flat brush for this one. I'm not going to pre-wet the brush. I'm going to get a little bit of paint on the edge. And I'm going to lay my paintbrush down. Now I'm actually holding it a little different because, oh, I didn't get enough paint on there. because I want to be able to just do it really loosely. So you're going to get a lot more texture of the paper with that one. All right, so let's move on to our tube watercolor. I think you're going to be surprised at the intensity of the tube watercolor as opposed to the intensity of the liquid watercolor. But I think you're also going to see how much more smooth the liquid watercolor is as opposed to the tube watercolor. All right, so we're gonna pre-wet our paper with some clean water. And I'm gonna go ahead and pick up some of this watercolor, and I'm dipping it in the actual watercolor, and then I'm taking it to the side where the water is, and I'm just gonna drop some of that in. So where the edges are still soft, this separation might stay where it didn't stay in this one. It was all evenly mixed, and so it becomes smooth where there's not. This one has more pigment in some areas and more water in some areas, so it stays more textured. This one, it's so evenly mixed, the pigment and the water, that it just became a smooth wash. So in order to get more layers on this, we just have to keep adding layers. Or in order to get more depth or texture or separation, we'd have to keep adding layers to that. It will also drip if we encourage it along, but it's not as easy to flow down the page with gravity. All right, the next one we're going to do is wet on dry. So once again, I'm going to dip my end of my paintbrush into that mix, and then I'm going to pick up about halfway up the brush. That is some pretty bold color there. Dry on wet. Dry on dry. I like to kind of push my flat brush out so that the hairs kind of separate when I do this. I am sticking the edge into the soft paint and then dragging it out just a little bit in the water, I don't want too much water, I want it to be dry, so. We're getting a little bit of pooling here in this corner. You don't want too much pooling. It will cause a back run, so. All right, and then with the cake watercolors, we're gonna go ahead and do wet on wet. So I'm gonna wet my paper here. And I'm gonna pre-wet my paintbrush, and I am going to just run my paintbrush along that cake and really loosen it up a lot. About halfway up that paintbrush. There. So wet on dry, so my paper's dry and my pigment is wet, so every time I just kind of loosen it up. Dry on wet, so we're gonna wet the paper. I'd say this is probably the hardest one to get to run. Definitely the hardest one to get to run. Yeah, it's not going. It's not going anywhere. So I'm gonna have pretty dry paintbrush, wet area. I do need to wet that just a little bit more. If it's not glossy on the top, you probably need to spray your paints again. So the dry on wet technique with this paint works really well because you can control how much pigment you get on that brush. And dry on dry. So I'm gonna spray these again there. They don't have that like bubble of water on top anymore. And go on the edge there so where it's drier. So I really feel like these drier techniques work a lot easier with the cake, but the wet techniques are not as easy. It is definitely the driest of the three. As watercolor dries, it does dry lighter. So it will be interesting to see if this one stays as vibrant. It's going to dry lighter, so it's still a little hard to compare these until they finish drying all the way. So in the meantime, let's draw a butterfly. And so what we're gonna do is I'm going to start with the head of the butterfly, the eyeballs, and I'm just gonna draw 2 circles. And then it's basically 2 curved lines that come to a point. So think like kind of like a raindrop. And we're gonna do that twice. We're gonna do that for the thorax and for the abdomen. So insects have 3 segments. They have their head, they have their thorax, and then the abdomen. And from the middle portion of their body, the thorax, that is where their wings span from. So one thing about a butterfly is it's supposed to be kind of symmetrical on both sides, meaning that if I folded it in half, it would make it would be the same. So I am going to draw one side, and generally this outside tip is farther out than this inside tip. So I think I drew that a little too far out. So I'm going to draw this side, and then I'm going to take my pencil and my finger, and I'm just going to kind of trace along And that can kind of help me make it more symmetrical. It's not a perfect technique, but it does help a little bit. And then the bottom wing is also going to come underneath. We're going to have some overlapping here. You know what? And I'm going to make the abdomen a little bit smaller. Okay, it's not perfect, but I kind of like it that way. I used to be obsessive about making drawings perfect, and now I've just realized that it's more like that's the imperfection is what helps an artist find their style. So those little quirks that you do when you're drawing, those are good. Embrace them. That's gonna make you different from the rest, and it's going to make it so it doesn't look like a photograph, because you might as well just take a photograph if that's what you're going to be obsessed about, making it look real. So, okay, so I have my 3 butterflies drawn out, and I'm going to start here with the liquid watercolor. So the very first thing that I do is I'm going to pre-wet the area. Now, something that you have to keep in mind when you are doing watercolor is if you wet one area and you add color to it and then you wet the area next to it and it's not dry, you're going to have it bleed into that area. So you need to work in segments, and a butterfly is the perfect thing to draw and work in segments because it is naturally divided into segments. So this is going to be hopefully a fairly simple project. To begin with, start with the largest areas first. Using clean water, we're going to start with a wash, or we're going to do the wet on wet technique. So we filled the wing with clean water, and now we're just dabbing in the color. So it's more of a dab and a push down than dragging the paintbrush across, and that way you're going to get more of the watercolor effects. If the watercolor isn't moving, add more water. It's tricky to get the right ratio of water to paint, but that will come with time and practice. I always like to add at least 2 colors to every area. So here I'm going to add a little bit of pink. Now I got too much color, and so I just took my clean brush, I dried it off so that it would suck up the water. I put the paintbrush in the areas that I wanted to suck up the paint, and then I dabbed them on the other side. And now I'm just gonna let it go. I'm gonna let it dry and not fuss with it anymore. I know that it's not well mixed, but it's gonna be okay. Let it do its thing. With watercolor, it's a balance of hard and soft edges. So if you get an edge that turns out hard but you want it to be soft, you can take a clean brush, you can dab it on your paper towel, and then you slide from the outside where the clean paper is into the paint to soften the edge. You can also work to soften an edge after the paint is dry. This is a little trickier and it's not going to work as well, but you can go back into the side and soften it up with a little bit of water and a clean paintbrush and around, working the paintbrush in a round movement. Now we're going to let that sit and dry and work on the next butterfly with the 2 paint. Try and pick some of that up. I had a dryer brush. Dried my brush. I got a little bit of paint and then I just drug it through where I dropped the water. I don't think you could really see it, but there was a puddle there, so really want to avoid puddles. I can do little veins like this with the edge of my brush as this is kind of starting to dry also. So this little chunk, I don't actually think it's gonna bother me because it's going to be darker there anyways, but that might be one of those areas where you dry your brush and you kind of soften up that chunk. I don't worry too much about things like that because I feel like you get really overly fussy, and that's those little like chunks and things. That's kind of the beauty of watercolor for me, is the unique ways that it dries. So I like it. I like that. It adds personality to me. So I don't mess around with it too much. I just kind of let it be. I let it do its thing. So now we're going to do the next section, which is going to be green and yellow. And I'm going to touch this section there with my finger just to make sure that it's dry. So how you know that the section next to the section you're painting is dry is you're going to want to make sure, one, that it's not glossy. If it's glossy at all in the light, it is definitely too wet to work next to. It's going to bleed. You're going to get runs. If it is cold to the touch, it's still wet. So you want to make sure that the paper goes back to room temperature. That's how you know that you can work next to it without getting the colors mixed together. Now, just because I don't want my colors to mix together doesn't mean that I won't go overlap the edges a little bit so that it feels connected, or it's basically doing a glaze over the top. So I did glaze the corners of some parts of this butterfly just to feel like it was all connected together. I can see that the corner of this butterfly is actually still wet. Sometimes I will drag the colors down from the painting also so that once again it feels more connected, like the butterfly parts belong to each other. So we started with the wet on wet technique, and in the larger areas, we started pre wetting the paper before putting the color down. Now we've moved on to the wet on dry technique, where we are using our large paintbrush still and very wet watercolor, but now we're not pre wetting the page as often. I don't know if you noticed what I just did, but I only have watercolor on the tip of this paintbrush just because it's a little larger, and but I wanted this edge to be blended, so I pushed my paintbrush down where I didn't have watercolor, but I have water on the brush, so that it kind of just softened that edge for me. I'm doing it over here too. So the tip has the color, and then I just kind of push the belly of the brush down and it disperses that without having paint there. Next, I'm going to work with the darker purple, and I'm just going to start doing the smaller details. I'm still using the same brush, I'm still using the same technique of wet on dry, and I'm just filling in those little areas. This is something that I will probably keep saying over and over again. The tube watercolor straight out from the tube is vibrant and bold. And so it is a nice thing to work with because you don't have to do as many layers to get that bold color. As I've said before, when the paint dries, it's going to dry lighter. But with this tube watercolor, it is a lot of pigment and a lot of strong color. That is definitely one of the perks of working with tube watercolor for me. One area where I feel like the liquid watercolor really shines is doing backgrounds. It is a lot of fun to use liquid watercolor, and it's so easy to make amazing backgrounds with liquid watercolor. So here I am pre-wetting this area and just putting some drops in, and I'm going to use the dark purple and then the pink, and I'm going to manipulate it a tiny bit so that it goes up to the edge of the butterfly. But other than that, I'm just going to let it go. Let it do whatever it wants to. I'm not going to try and control it and see what happens. I think that's the fun thing about using liquid watercolor, is a lot of surprises can happen. And it actually reminds me a lot of working with alcohol inks. I feel like it feels similar to me with watercolor. With backgrounds or large areas, I always pre-wet the surface. You're going to always want to do this because you can get that really beautiful feathered edge, and if you need to add more layers, it's much easier than having really hard edges that you have to work with in your background. So you want it to be more flowing than your subject matter, generally speaking. I'm doing a little splatter here with that dark purple paint on my brush. I just kind of tap it on my finger. You can't see it really well, but I do like to bring the background colors into the foreground, and that's a really easy way to do it, is just some light splatters. I did wet paint on dry paper, so I'm gonna come back in with a clean brush. I dabbed it, and I'm gonna kind of just soften that edge up so we don't get a hard edge there. this is a skewer, like a shish kebab skewer. So I'm just gonna take this shish kebab skewer, no paint on it, I'm just dragging it. I'm scratching the surface. This is called sgraffito. So it's indenting the paper and just scratching those antennae so they show up there. So this part is really quick with the putting on the color. The next part's gonna take a little more time. So while I wait for that to dry, I'm gonna mix some of my colors up. I want to mix a dark color. So I'm going to use, I want to mix a dark color because I'm going to do outlines. I'm going to put this over by the side for a minute while it dries. So I am going to use these opposite colors. To get my dark color. And I'm going to add a little bit of purple to it too. So fully concentrated, it's going to be really dark, and it is going to be fully concentrated. I'm going to do it with my fine liner here, but it's just a prettier, more rich color than just using black out of the tube. So if I want to even add more dark to it, I can add more purple so that it's even darker. But layering it is going to work too. So, all right, so I have a cooler dark color on this side. I have a warmer dark color on that side. The amazing thing about watercolor too, with any watercolor, is if this dries, I can always wet my paintbrush, re-energize it, and use it again. So I do love that about watercolor, where you cannot do that with acrylic. Once it's dry, you can't reawaken it. So, all right, I'm gonna use the lid here to mix the dark. I'm just gonna do kind of the same thing. Whoop! I can't believe I didn't just spill watercolor all over. That's pretty crazy. Look that up. Okay. I'm gonna get right into the meat of that. So something that's kind of fun to do is on one end you can test out one color. And then on the other end you can test out the other color. And then as they kind of mix together, you can see what changes. It would probably be better to do like green and then add more green and more, and then less green and more red. So you could actually have a few different examples. We can add some more red here on this end to see it. The different spectrums. When I'm mixing color, I like to keep my watercolors pretty clean, so I do like to kind of take care that it doesn't, unless it's like a dark color like purple, or kind of just stick it in there, but I like to clean my brush in between. This one's a little dirty, but I think it's more just because they are next to each other. That mixed really well. That's the color I'm going for here. I am going to try, now that I see that, I'm like, I kind of want to get my other colors to that point, so. Gotta figure out if I need to add more. Well, now that just turned purple. More green. To it. I almost stuck it in the wrong watercolors. Now that's too much red. That's pretty great. Okay. Now this one, I don't know if it will ever get to that point. It's just gonna probably take some layers. That's one thing with the liquid watercolor, the Ecoline. They just dry lighter, and they don't seem to have as much pigment in the paint. They're beautiful, and they are really fun in their own way, and the way that they mix together, but they just don't seem to get as intense. All right, now we're going to use the fine liner and do all of the details. It's the smallest work, but it takes the longest. If we do it right, hopefully these butterflies will pop out and really be beautiful. So one thing I'm thinking about right now is that this liquid watercolor is really easy to use. You don't have to worry about getting, as a beginner, as a beginner, you don't have to worry so much about getting the right water to paint ratio. So I think for beginners, this is a really good option. It can be kind of tricky to figure out how much water and how much of the watercolor to use when you're using these other types of watercolors. So this could be a really great option for starting out. It's very easy to use. And you definitely don't have to wet your brush as much. Like, I haven't really had to wet my brush at all while I've been working with this. Now that I'm getting like where there's less there and so they're drying out a little bit, I'm using my brush in the water a little bit more. Something else I'm noticing about this paint is it dries really fast. So I can just, it dries and I can just, if it's not quite as dark as I want it to be in value, and just add some more. It dries really smooth. Sure, I could probably re-wet this area even. I'm just gonna try it. I like it the way that it is. I just want to try it just to see what would happen if I did. So it didn't bleed too much. It stains the page, it looks like. I think this is where this fluid acrylic gets really interesting, is when you start adding some layers on top of the layers already. It really, I think it builds really well. So we'll let that dry and see kind of what happens there. with an extra layer there. Okay, moving on to this next one. It looks like it's pretty dry, so it will be easier to work with. I could scratch out. Let's try that. I could take an X-Acto knife or some sharp edge, and I'm just gonna see. All right, it dented the page, but you can't really see it a whole lot. So an X-Acto knife would actually cut away the paper rather than just pushing the paper down. We can use a white pen, like a Sakura gel pen, or we can use some white acrylic ink. So that's what I'm going to use here. I'm going to use some liquid acrylic ink from Amsterdam brand. And butterflies have a round tip on the end of their antennae. So, okay, I want to make sure and rinse my brush really good though when I use acrylic, because if I don't, it will be a goner. Oh, I tripped water on that spot on accident. That's why it has a little splash there. Another reason why I don't worry too much about my drawings is, honestly, if something bothers me, I can fix it the next time around when I'm adding colors. So on this one, you may or may not be able to see my pencil mark, and I thought that's a little too tight. So I brought the outline out a little bit more. So it doesn't bother me that you can see the pencil lines, the guidelines, and it doesn't bother me if I adjust them once I get some paint on and realize, like, that one I got a little too close to the inside and I want to bring it out more. One thing you'll learn too as you watercolor more is you'll find these happy accidents, and that's one of those things you have to learn to appreciate and keep some of those things, that the recognizing the beauty of the imperfections and not covering them up too much, or learning when to cover them up, because sometimes there's really beautiful, like this line here with the red was really beautiful, and I had to decide to cover it up even though I thought it was really pretty. Whereas this green, I decided to leave and come down a little bit lower so that the green peeked through. So there's 3 butterflies. They are Fluid from Ecoline. This one's their Tube, their Grumbacher Academy. And then these ones are the Prima Watercolors, Prima Marketing, and they're the Tropical. So there you have it. 3 watercolors. I think that they are all beautiful and fun in their own way, and there is definitely pros and cons to all 3 of them. So I hope that that's helpful. If it were me and I was only going to buy one set, I would probably buy the Prima Marketing watercolors. But the best way to find out what you prefer is to get your hands on each of them and try them out. Probably the easiest way to do that is not to buy sets, but to buy them individually and try them out. So you can go to an art store that has art supplies and buy individual bottles and just buy the ones that the colors that are attractive to you and you want to try, maybe 1 or 2 tubes instead of buying several. That's probably the best way to do it, is to give them all a try by purchasing less